Okay, so we have been talking about the intertidal zone and estuaries. We've talked about the rocky intertidal zone and the sandy intertidal zone. And then last class we started talking about estuaries. And the three characteristics that you have to be considered an estuary would be semi-enclosed, two types of water, the fresh and the salt water, and then mixing between those two types of water. So we talked about the four different kinds of estuaries and how they're formed, and then we looked at how water mixes in estuaries, and then we started looking at the different types of habitats that you'll find in an estuary. And one of the types of habitats that you would find would be an oyster reef. You also have like the subtidal region, which would be the region that would be underwater all the time. And then another type of habitat that can be associated with estuaries would be a mud flat. And a mud flat is simply exactly what it sounds like. It's a big flat area of the land that is covered in mud. And mud flats are oftentimes intertidal, so the mud flats get covered and uncovered by the tides every day, um, either once a day or twice a day, depending on the tidal pattern. And the mud flats are actually a very important habitat for lots of things that live in estuaries, because this is an area where burrowing animals can survive. So you'll have all sorts of worms and clams and all different kinds of crustaceans that will live in the mud flats. They'll come up to the surface to feed like when the tide is high, and they'll be moving around and eating as it's high tide. When it becomes low tide, the animals burrow into the sand to wait out the low tide and wait for the next high tide. The animals that live here are an important food source for lots of different things, like birds, and even some land predators will come out onto the mud flats in order to feed. And then in high tides, you'll also have fish and crabs that will move up and feed on the animals that live here as well. So mud flats are one type of habitat. And these pictures are to show you what a mud flat looks like. So they can be vast expanses that surround the subtidal region of the estuary. The picture in the upper left, that would be a picture there to help you see the different kinds of things that would live in those areas and how they would be burrowed down into the sand or mud. Other habitats that you'll find in subtidal regions, you'll oftentimes find seagrass beds in estuaries. Remember, seagrass is a primary producer. We talked about it last semester. And so you can find seagrass beds in estuaries. These are mainly subtidal, so they're going to be underwater. They're not really going to be exposed to the air. And seagrass beds are very, very important for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is they provide food for lots of different animals. They also help to provide protection from predators for many different animals and a place to live. So food, protection, and a habitat. Again, subtidal regions of some estuaries. Another type of habitat you'll find around estuaries are marshes. We also talked about salt marshes briefly last semester. Remember, salt marshes are made out of like rushes and all sorts of different kinds of plants that can withstand a certain amount of salt. And marshes are intertidal, so they do get covered and uncovered by the tides, and they tend to be around the edges of an estuary. Also, review from last semester, 4 things that are important that marshes do. They are a nursery, a sponge, a food source, and a filter. Okay? I'm not going to go over all of those things again because we talked about that extensively last semester, but you do need to remember those 4 reasons why marshes are important, because you will see them again on your quiz and on your test. So please remember why marshes are important. Nursery for lots of things. They help to reduce coastal flooding, provide a food source, and they filter out pollutants. Point Mugu Lagoon in Ventura is actually the largest functioning salt marsh in Southern California. So if you go to Point Mugu Lagoon, you can see what a salt marsh looks like and see lots of cool animals probably. So here's a picture to help you see all the grasses and stuff that will form the salt marsh are pictured there. And then you can see all sorts of different kinds of animals that would be living in those salt marshes. Remember, salt marshes are found only in temperate regions, So you'll only find them like around where we are and kind of in the higher latitudes, whereas you find mangrove forests in the tropics. So the mangrove forests are the tropical equivalent of the salt marshes. And so around estuaries in the tropics, you can find mangrove forests. So dangers to estuaries, because estuaries, as we've talked about previously, estuaries are very, very important habitats for many commercial species, and many commercial species spend part of their life in estuaries. Their baby years they spend in estuaries, and so when bad things happen to estuaries, we get a decline in our food source, so that's not good. One of the dangers to estuaries would be eutrophication, and eutrophication is an interesting process. So remember, rivers are running into the ocean, and rivers drain areas of land. And when they drain areas of land, they're going to be carrying all sorts of things in the rivers down into the ocean. And the estuaries stand in between the ocean and the rivers. So what happens is, as these rivers run into the ocean, they're carrying nutrients. So lots of excess nutrients. So like when farmers fertilize their crops, any excess fertilizers that don't get soaked into the soil and used by the plants, those get washed off of the land by rain. Okay, and that rain eventually makes it down into the river, which eventually carries those nutrients down into the estuary. So those nutrients make it into the estuary. And if you remember, again from last semester, the two things that plankton need to grow are light and nutrients. So now if you carry an excess of nutrients into the estuary and you have light because it's shallow water compared to the open ocean, you now get a huge phytoplankton bloom in an estuary. And you may think, oh, that's good, more food for other things. Actually, it's bad. What happens is the phytoplankton actually block light from plants that live deeper in the water, so on the bottom, like the seagrasses. If these like seagrasses and other plants don't get light, they can't do photosynthesis, and if they can't do photosynthesis, they die. When they die, they decay, and bacteria are the types of things that will be decaying these dead plants. As bacteria do the process of decomposition and break down these dead plants, they use oxygen. So decomposition requires oxygen to happen. So they will use oxygen. Because these plants are no longer able, or are dead, they're not doing photosynthesis, not creating oxygen, it actually creates this oxygen dead zone, okay, so, or a low oxygen zone, which we call a dead zone, because nothing can live there. So all plants and animals basically can't survive there because there's not enough oxygen for them to breathe. So it's a huge problem. We actually have a huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's larger than the state of Massachusetts in the water. It's kind of crazy. Oops. Okay. And so you get this low oxygen dead zone, and so you get all sorts of animals and stuff that can't live there. Some of the types of things that can't live there anymore would be clams and fish and stuff, because there's no oxygen for them to breathe. So big problem if you get eutrophication. Eutrophication can also occur in other areas in the ocean, like it can occur on coral reefs and stuff like that, which we'll talk about when we talk about coral and coral reefs. This picture is to show you the oxygen dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Mississippi River, okay, is right here, okay, and it's running down into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Mississippi River is really made up of a lot of other rivers. So you get a river that runs, the Ohio River that runs and meets the Mississippi River. Mississippi actually starts all the way up here, okay. You get the Missouri River that comes and meets here, the Mississippi, the Platte River, Arkansas River. Okay, they all run into the Mississippi, which eventually drains down into the Gulf of Mexico. So these rivers drain this entire area of the United States. And if you know anything about our country and where we grow our food, this area is one of the major areas where farming occurs. And one of the major things that farmers need to grow plants and stuff for our food is fertilizer to help them grow well. So when the Mississippi drains into the ocean, it's carrying all excess fertilizers and nutrients from this area and dumps it into the ocean, and you get this big dead zone at the bottom of Louisiana. So if you look in this picture right here, okay, here is like the boot of Louisiana, okay, Mississippi River running in right here and dumping in right here. This whole like dark shaded area, that is the dead zone that gets created from eutrophication, from excess nutrients running into the ocean. So it's kind of crazy. So that whole area, that size of the ocean that's bigger than Massachusetts, nothing can live there. The other danger, or another danger, to estuaries would be habitat loss. Most significantly, loss of marshlands, so salt marshes. So when we lose marshland, people tend to not just, be like, oh, here's a big area of marshland, let's fill all of this in and destroy this habitat. What tends to happen is people will take little pieces of marshland at a time, okay, and they'll be like, oh, I'll just use this little piece of marshland to build my house and we'll fill it in and it'll be fine. Well, if everybody does that, then you get lots of marshland that eventually gets used up and taken away and destroyed over time. So this has happened in many different places throughout the United States. In fact, San Francisco Bay, San Francisco is an estuary and had lots of marshlands around it. And we've lost now about 95% of the original marshland of the San Francisco Bay. And actually nationwide, we've lost about 50% of our marshes to development. So it's bad. The problem with like developing these marshlands is we lose the benefits of the marshes. So all of those benefits that we talked about, the filter, food source, nursery, and sponge, those are gone, those functions are gone if the marsh is gone. So it actually has a huge effect on the water quality and can lead to eutrophication in the estuary itself and can lead to all sorts of different kinds of things in an estuary. So habitat loss, especially of marshland, is very damaging to estuaries. So this picture is to show you the difference in marshland in San Francisco back in 1848. And the picture on the right is 1994, so it's not super accurate. It's probably less. We probably have less marshland than that picture shows. So the marshland is in pink, so you can see just how much marshland we've lost in San Francisco Bay. And if you look at the satellite image of San Francisco, everywhere that's gray, okay, on this picture, that's where the city of San Francisco is built. If you can see, compare that to the pink, that's where all of the marshlands used to be. So we've lost a lot of those marshes. Another threat to estuaries would be introduced species. So these are animals or plants that come into an estuary that are not native to that estuary. They're also called non-native or invasive species or introduced species. So basically, they're animals or plants that get brought to an area where they would not have been introduced on their own. So they get introduced some way, but they wouldn't have made it there on their own. The way that they actually get introduced into estuaries would be accidentally. So, for example, you have a pet, okay, and it escapes, okay, and that pet is pregnant because it's a female, and it reproduces, and the babies reproduce, and all of a sudden you've got an introduced species in a habitat where you normally wouldn't have had it. Or it could have come with another species. So let's say you import, a boa from Africa, and in the same crate that your boa comes in, you get like a fly. that makes it in the crate, and then that fly lays eggs and reproduces in an environment where it shouldn't be. So you can have accidental introduction. You can also have deliberate introduction. So for example, like let's say that boa that you ordered from Africa, you didn't realize how much work it was going to be to take care of. And so you're like, oh, rather than, like kill it or give it to somebody else, I will just go release it into the wild. It'll be fine. Okay, and so people release these pets in order to try and, let them live, because they can't take care of it. And so now you get an invasive species that can actually wreak havoc on an ecosystem because you released a pet. Or sometimes people aren't so smart and we deliberately release things that aren't normally found in an area to try and control another population of another animal. And then the species that we introduced ends up causing even more problems. So you have accidental introduction, deliberate introduction, and the main way that we get introduced species now is actually in ballast water. So ballast water is water that ships keep in their hull in order to stabilize the ship so that it doesn't fall over. And so you have a ship in China that will clear out its ballast water and then take in new water from the bay that it's in China. And then it comes over here and goes to San Francisco Bay. And when it's in San Francisco Bay, it releases the water that was in its ballast and as ballast water, and then takes up water from San Francisco Bay. And so when that ship releases the water that it got in China, it's going to be releasing all sorts of larvae and all sorts of animals that are found in China but aren't found here. And so you get introduction of species that way as well. Okay, so those are the three main ways that we get introduced species. So why introduced species are a problem? They're a problem because the introduced animals or plants will compete with the native plants and animals in order for resources, so for space or for food. And oftentimes the introduced species is better at competing than the native plant or animal. And so it actually takes over and can actually cause the native plants and animals to die out, which is bad. An introduced species can also destroy a habitat or alter it so that the native species can't survive. So the Chinese mitten crab is an invasive species, and it's a problem because it can burrow into wooden things, and so it is actually damaging a lot of our levees and stuff like that because it burrows into wooden things. Or the introduced species can't be used by the native plant animals. So you get a plant that gets introduced and it starts growing and flourishing, but none of the native animals that live there can eat it. So it's a problem because that plant would take up the normal space and resources that would go into growing the things that the native species could actually eat. So it's a problem. Also, you can have introduced diseases by invasive species. So some of these can be introduced diseases to humans. So we actually have liver fluke that comes in the Chinese mitten crab, and we can't eat the Chinese mitten crab because it carries this liver fluke and we could get sick from it. It also can affect native populations. So this introduced species would bring a disease to a native species, and the native species can suffer greatly because they have no immunity to this disease. So introduced species are bad. Very, very bad. Okay, people are working to try and replace and repair our estuaries. So particularly they're focusing on marshes, salt marshes, and also oyster reefs. The Clean Water Act of 1972 is one of the ways that is helping to protect estuaries because it helps to increase the quality of the wastewater that gets dumped into rivers and stuff, and therefore decreases the amount of eutrophication. The Endangered Species Act also helps because it protects the habitat of many of the endangered species. well, of all the endangered species. And so it will, if the habitat is protected and they live in an estuary, then the estuary is protected. So that's good. And then public awareness is always a big thing when it comes to repairing and helping to restore estuaries. So people won't take action if they don't realize that there's a problem. So people need to be made aware of the fact that there's a problem in order for them to take action to try and fix it. So that's what we're doing to try and repair estuaries. So you now have all the notes that you need for Cycle 8. You will have a quiz on either A Day or B Day, depending on when I see your section. So make sure that you study hard and that you do well on your quiz.